So the latest polling shows Spencer Cox ahead by 35 points. Is this a foregone conclusion?
It's the worst question, because what's important is not who will win, but who should win. And that's what I want people to think about. I know I'm the underdog, and we've had Republican governors for a long time in this state, but each citizen has an obligation to use their mind and their heart and think of the best path forward for our state. And as a reasonable moderate that's prudent with our resources and our finances, I actually am a good option for this state, a better option than the polls should indicate. And I hope that people are starting to learn a little bit more about me and are going to give me a chance. I'm asking for their vote.
Okay, but it's up to you to convince people of that. So what are you doing beyond this to overcome that obstacle that you're facing?
Sure. Well, we're running a statewide campaign with to the best of my ability, with the resources that we have. And I'll be honest, it's been pretty tricky. It's been a little bit hard with the coronavirus crisis, especially when you're an outsider. I'm not as everybody knows, I'm a first-time political candidate. Of course, I do have a lot of experience in government, at the federal government, at the highest levels of the federal government. But we're running a statewide campaign. We've got some advertising coming out. We've raised some money. It's nowhere near as much as my opponent has, but I also believe that actually speaks well of me, because some of the campaign contributions that my opponent, he's a good guy, but some of his campaign contributions, I believe, actually throw his loyalties and his judgment into question. So the fact that you haven't heard as much about me, actually, I think is evidence that, maybe there's something there. I'll also remind you that I did get 84%, or it was 88% of the support in the Democratic primary, which was far higher than my opponent got in the Republican campaign, primary campaign, even though I was in a crowded field of 6 candidates as well. So I do think that there is some strength behind my campaign. We've got almost 20 staffers and well over 100 volunteers that are making thousands and thousands of phone calls across the state. We have an active social media presence, and we're soon going to be having some television ads and billboards along the I-15 corridor. So look, but what I need is help from you, help from the press, to actually tell a little bit more about my policies, about my story, because the public has a right to know, and they need that information. I can't do it without you. Please help inform the public about the reasonable options that they have in choosing their next governor.
Is this going to be a referendum, this election, do you think, on the state's handling of COVID, or is that what you'd like?
Well, no, I think that's maybe the most important issue we're facing right now, because we are in a global pandemic where many people are dying, and it's the biggest challenge for our economy. But there's many, many more things. Our economy long-term, our education. I also feel like we're not talking enough about the ballot measures that the public passed in the last election. You were asking me about whether or not there was support behind my campaign, but I'll have you recall that a majority of the public voted for Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana under the supervision of a physician, and also fair legislative redistricting, only to see their state legislature undermine, water down, and repeal and replace all 3 of those ballot measures. I am on the right side of all 3 of those issues. My opponent is not. So who should the public be voting for if they support my position on those important public policy issues? I think that's part of why it's time for change.
Interesting to hear you reach out to us and say, I need your help. Obviously, as the media, we're not your comms arm of your campaign. Why do you make that comment? Do you feel like you're not being treated fairly in the media here?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we have a cacophony of information in our current society. It's very difficult to get attention from people in our society. And, journalists have a role to play, not as my communications director, but informing the public. That is the principal mission of journalism. Now, sometimes movie studios or social media companies feel like the principal job of journalism is to make the management and investors money. I don't believe that's the case for the journalists. The journalists, their job is to try to get out there and tell the truth and gather information. And it's just that I'm confident, if you dig into my policy views, my background, my experience working for the United States Department of Defense and for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, what you'll find is that I am a credible candidate for governor of this state and would actually be a breath of fresh air. I'm not what sometimes people think about, the Democratic Party. I'm a Utah Democrat with deep roots in this state and will be committed to working my tail off to do everything I can to try to make the world a better place for my fellow Utahns. I'm hoping that you'll help tell that story because it's the truth.
Let's take a question now from Zoom.
Great, thank you.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. Chris, could you elaborate a little bit on your pledge not to raise taxes, but your call for more taxes on wealthier Utahns? How does that translate into more money for schools if you simply redistribute the tax burden, the existing tax burden, as opposed to actually increasing rates on the wealthy to bring in more dollars?
So, Lisa, thanks for the great question. First off, my pledge is to not raise food taxes. That's my pledge. As far as other types of taxes and revenue, I believe that we should return to a more progressive income tax structure. I do believe that we can successfully fund our programs better by not raising taxes and perhaps even potentially lowering some taxes on low to moderate income earners. But I do think that we need to expect a little bit more from some of the businesses who are thriving and from some of our wealthiest individuals. And look here, I want to be very clear. We're talking modest amounts. Nobody's suggesting that we go back to the 70% marginal income tax rates that we had back during the Eisenhower administration. But what we have done, the choice that we made in the Huntsman administration to go to a flat income tax has hobbled our public education system in this state because we need some revenue for those kids. And so I think that, look, I would support, doing away with a flat tax and having some gradual tax brackets to try to raise some additional revenue. And I also, what goes hand in hand with that, and please be very clear about this, what goes hand in hand with a progressive income tax is lower taxes on low to moderate income families that are struggling to make ends meet. That's where I'm at.
So you are in favor of an income tax increase overall, bringing in more income taxes by returning to a progressive tax structure that taxes the wealthy more?
Well, that's also not what I said. What I said was that I'm in favor of a progressive income tax, whether or not that by itself increases revenue overall, or we have sufficient revenue that we can pull in from closing off tax credits, tax loopholes, and tax incentives without changing the net haul from just the marginal progressive rates? Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, but I am, and I'm standing by this. I do think that that it's fair and right and the morally correct thing to do to ask a little bit more from our fellow Utahns that are doing really well, specifically to give that money back to the kids. We have the lowest per pupil funding in America. We have the highest teen suicide rate in America, and we've got to do a better job. I know that it's hard. I know we have a lot of kids, but we can't keep leaving children behind. So that's where I'm at.
So again, just to be clear, because I thought I heard you say during the debate you were not in favor of raising any taxes, but that's not necessarily the case.
I think what I said, go ahead.
Taxes,
I think
right?
I'm.
And so you are opening the door to possibly raising the amount of income tax collected in the state, but you'd want to see what you could get from closing loopholes, et cetera, before you would actually bring in more income taxes.
Yes.
Otherwise, just redistributing what you have.
Yes,
Okay.
you got it right. That's it.
So how much more is needed?
What specific dollar amount? I don't know that off the top of my head. I'd have to go dig into numbers, and I'm not going to give numbers without knowing what they are.
One last question.
I'm enjoying the scrum. It's better than the debate.
Any other Zoom questions?
During the debate, oftentimes in the coronavirus conversation, the lieutenant governor would admit, yeah, we've made mistakes, we've done things we could have done better, but Utah's doing better than other places. Do you agree with that?
Better in what respect?
Recovery, economic, number of hospitalizations, deaths.
Well, so first off, we are better on deaths, but I think that has much more to do with the low age. We're a young population, and we're also pretty physically fit in this state, and I suspect that has much more to do with it than the coronavirus response from the government itself. So good for Utah for being fit and for weathering the disease better. But second, that doesn't mean that we are doing all we can. Those are people who are still passing away or suffering long-term illness. They still count. And just because our death rates are not the same as Alabama or some other state, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing everything that we reasonably can to try to save those lives and get our economy back on track. And it's also the same thing for unemployment. I agree, we have relatively unemployment rates, but we also have some real other economic challenges. We're 34th in the country in terms of the number of people, or percent of people who are covered by health insurance. And it's ironic that right now, my opponent is currently supporting, and the state of Utah is using our tax dollars to try to invalidate the Affordable Care Act, also known as Romney Care, before it was the Obamacare, which will authorize discrimination against, authorize insurance companies to discriminate against people for pre-existing conditions, including, for example, coronavirus. So not only are we closing our health clinics, low-income health clinics, we're also setting up in a new insurance marketplace that is going to leave more and more people who don't have access to care. And that's not okay. Is that a good response economically? In my view, it's not, because I care about ordinary working people across the state. I care about whether or not they have access to health care. I care about whether or not their kids get good educations. And I think that we have a lot of improvement in that, in our coronavirus response. All right, thank you. It's an honor.